So yeah, today is the BDD conference, and the workshop that you're having today is on suicide prevention. So my name is Arti and I work for a national charity called Papyrus, Prevention of Young Suicide. Before I start and go into some of the ground rules and things, has anybody heard of us before today as a national charity? Okay, so there's a small number of people in the room, but for the majority of people they haven't, and that's actually not massively surprising, unfortunately, for the work that we do. But throughout this presentation you'll get an idea to hear a little bit more about the work that we do and some of the things that we can do in our community to help to prevent suicide. And hopefully you all will leave here today with an idea about, you know, a service that's available to help support young people. But I just want to echo that today's session is a presentation, it's not a training. So the intention is that you will not leave here today being able to intervene with the thoughts of suicide, because we can't do that in such a short amount of time. But hopefully you will leave here with a lot more knowledge and awareness than what you started with, and aware of services that are available if you need any help and support. And we do actually have a stall here today as well in the main area. So if you guys have any further questions or anything you want to ask, you can come and see us then. I'm going to hand over to my colleague in a minute, but before I do want to just set up a little bit of safety around today's presentation. Suicide isn't an easy topic to talk about. At Papyrus, we probably say the word suicide about 10,000 times a day. It's not a normal person's experience, and I've worked with Papyrus now for over 3 years. So I've become quite okay with talking about suicide and okay with hearing people's experiences. But it's important to acknowledge that people have different experiences around suicide, and please look after yourself if you need to. That's the message of today. If you need to take a few minutes out to step outside, take a break, and maybe come back in, that's absolutely fine. Please do that. You know yourself better. I want to reassure you, though, that we do take what we do very seriously, and we will always talk about suicide in a way that's sensitive and appropriate, and we will use language that is as well. But that being said, like I said, because I'm not too sure about people's experiences, if you do need a bit of time, then obviously please do take time for yourself. And then myself and my colleague will be around later as well if anybody wants to talk to us. So I will hand over to my colleague to introduce himself.
So I'm Bruce Clark, pleased to meet you all, and I'm standing close to Artie. We're enjoying presenting together, but we have one radio mic, so it's helping get the recording for the presentations. So I'm Bruce Clark. I'm a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist. I work in the same team as Amita Jassy, who you've heard present this morning. So I'm based at the Maudsley Hospital in London in the National Specialist Service for OCD, BDD and related difficulties. And I often, just like Amita has, give presentations about BDD or OCD. It's my sort of daily working bread and butter, if you like. And something I would say quite often, I have to say, when I'm presenting about body dysmorphic disorder particularly, I started my consultant career as a clinician in one of our borough services. So we provide specialist services, but we also provide borough community services. And I have to say, when I look back, I think I would be representative of some of the issues that Amita talked about. BDD, for many clinicians, is still a Cinderella subject. It's something that people know so little about, and I often reflect on the fact that when I worked in community services, one of the jobs that I had to do as a community consultant was help our team think about the support we offered to the accident and emergency department, which is where people and young people, I've always worked with children and young people, would present if they'd self-harmed or made attempts on their life. And I look back, I have to say, with regret, where my colleagues would go over and assess people, and on occasions where they were a little bit stuck or needed some guidance, would come back and present those difficulties and things that they'd seen to me to help them make decisions. And when I think back, I honestly can't remember ever in 10 years of doing that, having a conversation about body dysmorphic disorder. Now, I've come a long way since then. I've worked in the National Service for Body Dysmorphic Disorder now for 8 years. And of course I think about those things, but it's just really emblematic if I think about my own career as part of the journey that we have to go on to think about the supports and kind of issues that we have to consider when we're thinking about self-harm, suicide, and particularly in this context in relation to BDD. So that's just a little bit of background, and it's also just to kind of highlight that so that we can all be honest and share experiences, and you know, I'm on a learning journey about this, as I've already described. So that's a little bit about my background, and I'm going to hand it back to Artie.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's, for those of you who haven't heard about Papyrus, let's tell you a little bit about our story. So Papyrus Prevention of Young Suicide is a national charity, and it was actually formed over 20 years ago in the very north of the country in Cheshire. We were actually formed by parents who quite tragically lost their own children to suicide. Now, what we know exists today is quite a lot of stigma around suicide. People still struggle to really talk about it, but we can imagine over 20 years ago, the stigma was even, the stigma was even greater than it is today. You know, what these parents found was that community members and family members wouldn't even acknowledge that a suicide had occurred. They'd find that people would avoid the topic altogether. They wouldn't even acknowledge. They'd say, oh, you don't have to tell the person that they died by suicide, you can tell them it was something else instead. We don't have to say that word. And they also found that people just would cross the streets when they saw them, and they just wouldn't know what to say to them. Now, when you've been bereaved, it can be really difficult to know what to say to somebody when you know someone around you has been bereaved. But when someone's been bereaved by suicide, it can be even more difficult to know what to say and how to have a conversation. So these parents found other parents that had unfortunately been in the same scenario as them, and they kind of got around a table together and said, you know, it's not okay that we live in a community where our young people might be part of education or health or faith community groups or part of work, and nobody seemed to have picked up on the signs that they were in distress. Nobody seemed to pick up on the signs that they were thinking about suicide. And it's also not okay that we live in a community where young people believe the only option is suicide. Because there needs to be some help and support to make them realise that it isn't the only option. So that is really the huge motivating factor as to why they started Papyrus. Papyrus as a name is also really interesting. When many people think about papyrus or the word papyrus, they think of Egyptian paper, because it's often the paper that we use. And there is a link to that. But Papyrus as a name is an acronym, and it's Parents Association for the Prevention of Young Suicide. So what's really unique about the work that we do is that we draw extensively on the experiences of those who have been bereaved by suicide. 80% of our members on our board of trustees are a parent or somebody who's been bereaved by suicide. So we're still drawing from that today. I mentioned there was a link to Egyptian paper. Our founding mom was a lady called Jean Kerr, and her son died by suicide. And he was absolutely obsessed with everything to do with Egypt. So it's a little bit of a lovely memorial to him as well, and a nod to something that he absolutely loved with the name Papyrus. So you can see we've got a really strong and very powerful history. Our head office is actually still in Cheshire, in Warrington, if any of you guys know that far north from here. Actually based in Warrington, and that is where the founding parents started us, and I think that's where we'll always be, because it really does honour the tradition and the history of where we started. We've got another office in West Mids, we've got a London office, and we have a Wales office. So as a charity, we are almost UK-wide. But your next question might be, well, what do you guys do as an organisation? We believe that we can help to prevent suicide in the community, and we believe that we can help many people to prevent suicide in the community as well. So one of the ways that we do that is with a helpline. Anyone who is 35 and under who is thinking about suicide can actually call, text and email to get some help and advice. I'm going to tell you a lot more about that at the end. I just mentioned a bit of a clue about young suicide prevention there. We actually work with 35 and under as young suicide, because sadly, as a fact that is not so well known today in our community, is that suicide is the leading cause of death under the age of 35 in men and women in the UK today. It's not a fact that is as known as much as it needs to be, and that's why we target such a specific age range. So all the services and everything that we do are specifically for that age range. So we have a helpline, and I will definitely tell you more about that towards the end, and you'll be able to take some stuff away with you on that. But in the community, what we do is training and awareness raising, because we believe that each and every one of you sitting here today are the experts in your own community. You know the young people that you come face to face with. You know the people in your either personal life or in your professional life. So if I trained each and every one of you in suicide prevention and awareness skills, you'd know what to look for. You'd know to have the confidence in talking about suicide. We'd have conversations around language, what language is safe to use when it comes to suicide, what language might be inappropriate to use when it comes to suicide, and what do we do when somebody says yes? That's what we do in the community. So we train individuals in their communities, professional or personal, to take those skills in there and spread that message of we can spot this, we can help support this. It's almost like creating that huger and wider Papyrus family. To give a little bit of context about London, I'm the regional manager for London, but as a team there's only 5 of us and we cover all of London and we do outside of that as well. So it's a huge area to cover, right, with at least 8 million people. So having Papyrus family and people in the community to spread the message is really important for us. The third thing that we do is all around campaigning. So we've got a couple of campaigns that we're going to come to in a bit, and we'll show you some videos around that. But first, let's look at the issue in our community today. How big of an issue is suicide? What are the stats? What are we looking at? I already shared that it is the leading cause of death, but let's look at what those numbers might mean. Now, we've got statistics from 2018, and the 2018 statistics from the Office of National Statistics were actually released in the first week of September this year. So fairly new, fairly recent to have this. So if we take age out of it completely, and this is where age is completely taken out of it, if we look at all age ranges in suicide, there were 6,507 reported suicides in the UK. Does anybody know what I mean by reported suicides? Why I use that terminology?
It's on the coroner's report.
Absolutely. So the coroner is the only person in our community and our society that can reach the verdict of suicide. Now, you may have a circumstance where it is maybe known in the community, maybe by the method that somebody used, that it is a suicide, and they possibly left a note. But you may also have in that circumstance where the coroner does not reach the verdict of suicide, and sadly that does happen. And there's a number of factors as to why. So this figure, 6,507, relates to where the coroner has reached that verdict of suicide, where it's actually recorded. What we believe in Papyrus is, while this number is absolutely huge, we don't think it accurately reflects as much of the suicide that we unfortunately have in the community. Now, there's been a change in the way that the coroner has actually reached the verdict of suicide recently. Previously to last year, the coroner would use the burden of proof. So they would have to be able to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that something was a suicide in order for them to do that. So that meant if there was any doubt, even when somebody's left a suicide note, they can't record it as a suicide. It may go under an accidental death, a death by misadventure, which is a death by engaging in risky behaviour, or an open or narrative verdict. At the end of last year, and we've been campaigning for 7 years for this change, the change came into effect where now they use the civil standard of proof, the civil standard of probability, which is how deaths and murders are recorded. So they will now look at probable cause, which means it's more likely we will have more suicide verdicts in cases that are suicide. So what we might find in the next few years is that number does go up, but not necessarily because we're having more people take their own life in our community, but because we're able to accurately represent the number of people that we are losing to suicide. Because at Papyrus, we've been doing this for over 20 years, but nobody seems to know the scale of the issue, and we want people to take this seriously and know that we need to do something about it, and there is something that we can. But let's break that number down even further, and let's look at young. I mentioned that young suicide is 35 and under, and that's our definition. So we're going to look at that age. So of that 6,507, there were 1,866 recorded suicides of that number for 2018. Also, to note on this number, the figure actually starts from 10 years old. Does anybody know why the suicide figures start from 10 and not younger?
Parents' responsibility?
Yeah, so it's all about the legal age of responsibility. According to the law, if you're under the age of 10 and you do take your own life, and unfortunately it does happen, not in huge numbers, but it does, the law doesn't recognise that you are emotionally, mentally able enough to understand the consequences of the decision that you've made. So it will not be recorded as a suicide. So the suicide statistic that we're looking at here is 10 to 35. So if it's under the age of 10 and it is a suicide, it will be recorded as an open verdict, a narrative verdict, death by misadventure, accidental death. It will go under something else. And let's break that number down even further and look at school-age children. And on average, every year, quite sadly, we lose around 200 school-age children to suicide. So, looking at that and breaking that down, it can feel really shocking. And I don't put it up there for it to be shocking. I put it up there for it to raise awareness of the issue in the community and why Papyrus exists to do what we do today. Why it's so important that the message of this is shared with people today, so that people are aware that there is something that needs to be done. But what I'm also going to share with you today is what can be done. But before we do that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Bruce Clark to maybe tell us a little bit more about suicide and suicidal ideation in BDD.
So I don't have lots to say in the sense that Amita's already covered this topic a little bit, and the important thing for us to hold in mind, and indeed why we're thinking about that within a BDD conference, is that suicidal ideation and suicide attempts and sadly completed suicides are much more common in a population of people with body dysmorphic disorder. Now, the data, Amita talked about some of that this morning. There have been limited studies that have looked at that, and I don't think any of them have looked at that particularly effectively. So people have often looked within specialist clinics, people who get referred through to specialist clinics such as my own or adult services around the UK and internationally. And obviously those people who come through to specialist clinics have had to cross lots and lots of hurdles and perhaps are not representative of the population of a whole, of patients or including people with BDD. But nonetheless, the key message is that body dysmorphic disorder is associated very typically with a lot of thoughts around suicide, so including that spectrum feeling from life isn't worth living to thinking about suicide to then suicidal behaviours and unfortunately completed suicide. So all of those things are much more common in people who have BDD. The other thing that I wanted to add just at this point, however, we're here to think about trying to think about risk, manage risk around that and do something about it. A key point is each piece of research that's been done and looking at treatments for BDD have also thought about the impacts on suicidal ideation, suicidal behaviours and so forth. And each and every one of them shows that the treatments, be it the psychological therapies, the talking therapies, and the medication-based treatments, or those things together, have a profound and positive impact on reducing those difficulties. So it is an important message to emphasise that treatment for BDD is an important way to address, of course, the whole of those difficulties, as well as the suicidal thoughts, ideas, and actions associated with them. The other thing, interestingly, that I was talking with a colleague this morning, there's been some recent research where people have been given advice where they're managing risk and managing risk in their homes, in their communities, in their clinical practice around positive risk management. So people present to our services and work with us and work with, our families are supporting people, and have for many years been given advice by practitioners around keeping your home safe, thinking about risk items in the home environment, moving knives, thinking about how medicine's stored at home, all of those sorts of things. And actually there's been a debate for clinicians as to whether those things make a meaningful difference to the impact on suicidal behaviours and completed suicides. People have often hypothesised, for instance, that if you're advising to do things like that, it may not make an impact. How can you make a world around us completely safe? But actually, there's been some fairly robust data looking in adult services that those interventions, those sort of things are important and do make a significant and positive impact on managing people's risk, which is an important thing to have looked at, because as clinicians, we've done that and we've supported families to think about those things, but haven't necessarily been clear that they do make a positive impact. So some of those basic steps and some of the things that Artie will go on to talk about are indeed important things for us as clinicians, families and communities to think about as part of reducing suicidal risks within our communities.
Thank you. So we're going to move on now to look at a video, and this is a video from one of our campaigns around spotting the signs of somebody being at risk of suicide. We'll watch the video first and then we'll get some thoughts. I'll give you a bit of context and we'll have a bit of a group discussion.
too. Yeah.
I don't know you, but like, that just really saw it, and I just impacted me a lot. Have you seen anybody? No. I'm just not feeling so great at the minute. I just feel like I've not really got much choice.
Oh, sorry, that finished a bit earlier than it should do, but that is the end of that the video. So it's a really short clip. It's about an hour, a minute and a half long. But just to give some context about that, so that's been over 2 years now that we created that, and the only people that knew what was happening in that were the 4 actors we hired, the 4 young people, to walk around with those suicide statements. And those statements were chosen because they're the things we hear fairly regularly from our young people on the helpline. These are the statements that they're telling us when they call us. This is what they're saying about suicide. So it's quite distressing to see some of that out in the public. And what we know about signs is it isn't often ever really that visible like that. People don't walk around with those boards or those signs that will indicate what's maybe happening to them or what they're thinking. We did it as safely as we could, of course, and I want to reiterate that it's really important that there was safety. You know, we put notices up in and around the public areas that we were filming, and we had suicide prevention advisors available in case anybody felt a little bit triggered or felt upset by what they saw, so they could get some help and support. So we did it as safely as possible. But we can see that there's quite some interesting takeaways from that. Does anybody maybe want to share some reflections on what they saw in that, or any takeaways?
People seem very awkward looking at it.
Yeah, so what we noticed was a lot of people seem to have noticed our young people, but we didn't necessarily engage with them. We saw that quite a lot, didn't we? And I think what's really important at this stage to note is that there's probably really valid reasons why they didn't stop, and that's okay. You know, this is a complete stranger on the street that's got a sign like that, you know. There's probably stuff around that like we don't know whether to approach. I've actually had some people say I probably wouldn't have gone near them because I thought it might have been a publicity stunt, for example, so I don't know if I wanted to engage with that. We can also acknowledge that for some people who saw our young people with those signs, maybe they had been affected by suicide themselves. And maybe they thought, if I engage with this person, what's that going to do for me? What's that going to do to me? Because I'm not ready to go there again. And actually, one of the biggest things that we know is a myth in our community that a lot of people still believe today is that if we talk openly about suicide and we say the word, it can make things worse and give someone the idea. That is the greatest myth that definitely is in our community around suicide. Because actually what research and evidence tells us is if somebody's thinking about suicide and you talk to them in a way that's sensitive and safe and appropriate and open, they actually feel more relief that they can talk about it than actually not. So there's probably a lot going on for those people that didn't stop. What do you think we might have noticed in the people that did stop? Does anybody have any reflections? Because we noticed some people that did. They did stop and talk to our young people.
There was a young lady who was very compassionate, and it looked like she had empathy for the human being that was there.
Yeah, yeah. And that could be for a number of reasons, couldn't it, based on her own experience, absolutely. Interestingly, though, we saw some interesting language there, you know, why have you got this on yourself? You're not really going to do that, are you? It's quite interesting, isn't it, some of the stuff. Why have you got that on yourself for? And actually, there are ways that we can talk about suicide that can be unhelpful in that respect. So you're not thinking about suicide, are you? It's not really the best way to ask questions. So there are ways in the community that we can definitely look at informing and raising some awareness about how we might talk a bit safely. But we did notice some people stopped. I always get really struck by the lady with the young boy who actually physically takes the sign off him. And I always think that's quite powerful imagery about that, because one of the things that we talk about in suicide first aid training, for example, is about physical takedowns and how we talk about verbal takedowns compared to physical takedowns. And we always say that physical takedowns are never anything that we would ever say people should do. But it almost reminds me of that is what maybe she would do in that scenario. Because what we know about physical takedowns is you can't remove the method and the barrier that's there. And also you will put yourself in more danger if you're physically going near somebody who is about to take their own life. It's about verbally talking to someone that actually has research and says and evidence has more impact. and getting somebody to consent to come down themselves. So we've watched a little bit of video about some of the signs. We know that people don't walk around with those signs, but I'm going to hand over to you guys now to have a little bit of a discussion if you're comfortable to. And I want you to think about, what are those signs that we're looking for? We know that our young people don't walk around like that. So what are we looking for when somebody's suicidal? Now, just to be clear, what's underlying for a lot of people who are suicidal is pain and distress. So let's take a step back even further and think about somebody who might be in pain or somebody who might be in distress. What are those things that we might see? What actions might they be doing? What might they be saying? What types of things might they look like? What types of things might they express their feeling? If someone's in pain or distress, what are we seeing? What are we hearing? So maybe in small groups or the person next to you, just have a quick 5-minute discussion, and then we're going to come back and we'll get some more as a big group together. Thanks, guys. Thank you guys for that. It sounds like it was quite animated, a lot of the discussions, and I think if we had a lot more time, we would definitely go into a bit more detail. So does anybody want to share what some of the discussion might have been in the group, if you're comfortable to, some of the things that you were talking about around the signs to somebody who might be in pain and distress? Sorry, did you have your note?
Yeah. So one question or sign I think we talked about was, some people present with, I want to do harm to myself, and then some people wake up in the morning and feel overwhelmed and have very serious considerations of suicide, and they haven't gone through the process of weeks and weeks telling friends there's no hope, this and that. It's just, hey, wake up overwhelmed and great, go off the side of the balcony, it's over. And so that second one is what's particularly scary for me. In the United States, there's the misunderstanding that people who talk about it don't do it. Okay. So what are there distinctly clinically two different kind of types of people who are reaching out for help and maybe it's histrionic or whatever, as opposed to people who, or some of them actually commit suicide, but can you share your experience with that?
It's really interesting, isn't it, about the impulsiveness of some of the acts around suicide, and then people that might have suicidal ideation for a really long time. So yeah, maybe we could do that jointly.
So yes, there is a lot of thinking and research that supports that. So there's a group of people who think about suicide and can engage in suicidal behaviours associated with that. And it's always been one of the things that sort of plagued researchers who look very closely at self-harm and suicide, that perhaps they're working with a very particular group of people who are in services. And if you look at the statistics of people who complete suicide, the truth is the majority of people with completed suicides that Artie was talking about before the majority of those people are not using mental health services. And that's been known from epidemiological studies looking at suicide. So there's definitely something in what you say, that some completed suicides may well be, I don't want to say the word impulsive glibly, but not calculated, not part of a read through directly from building up to it. So the description that you give of sort of waking up one day and being very clear about it is part of the spectrum of difficulties that suicidal thoughts can present. And that latter group is the most difficult to research and best understand in terms of risk management. What people know from research where it's been possible to get people with those difficulties, of course, the majority of those people have been folks who have had mental health difficulties and are just not using services. And even those studies don't necessarily have the right information in them. The best that have been done have described just how common in that group depressed thoughts are. But people haven't even gone out to that group and screened for things like OCD and BDD. It's a very poorly understood group, that sort of impulsive completed, and we just don't know what the lead up was. But yeah, and there have been a number of high profile examples that we've seen in the media. There was a very high profile example of a person who took their life in Heathrow Airport, and people very carefully tried to understand and piece together the timeline for that individual, and that had a lot of press here in the UK. And people just never get to the bottom of it, and families can feel very mystified as to why that happened in a completely different way perhaps to people who've had those more enduring experiences of people struggling with their mental health for periods. That was a long-winded way to agree with you. Yes, that is an issue. Yeah.
I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that I guess if somebody's in pain and they've been in pain for a really long time, there's going to be a number of things that can act as their triggers as they go through that journey, that pain journey. There might be things that they do to try to lessen that pain, and that could be negative or positive, and there could be things that they do that do work and that don't work, and the impulsiveness could be that they have felt it for a really long time, but on that day the one thing that does happen, and I can't say this for all of course, but for some people one day that thing happens and it just for them is like, this is it, I've had enough, I can't take any more of this, like this is enough now, I just can't deal with any more of this that's actually happening. I've had a case recently that's come through really interesting to the office of somebody who's pregnant, and she's had a lot of mental health issues, had a lot of issues with work, but she had an issue fairly recently where there's issues with money and debt, which she didn't realise because it was a wrong address, and so nobody was contacting her, so she didn't realise. So it's built up to a point now where it's quite a lot of money, and she's just been informed and things have been taken away, and we had to get the emergency services involved because you know, she was just like, that's it, I'm done, I've had enough, that's it. And because of all the things that she has been dealing with over the period of time, and with the pregnancy as well, and with her emotions, you know, there's been a lot. It's quite heightened, a lot of the stuff that is. So it's quite individual for people's experiences for those days, and it might seem quite small. It might seem really small on that day that somebody maybe didn't smile at them or say hello, or they felt a bit ignored. But actually, it's in a long line of a lot of other stuff that's been happening and building up for that person. And it's really hard to track and understand that journey necessarily unless we have their voice, and unless they're kind of around to kind of share that with us. But no, absolutely, there can be an impulsiveness to that, but we may not be getting the story behind that in terms of that impulsiveness. Any other thoughts on some of the signs? Any actions, any feelings, and any words?
We didn't actually discuss this, but it's something I'd like to know because you have background research and so on. I've believed actually for a long time that sometimes it's catching. And I was confirmed in this when there was an area in the southwest where there were young people who were, the numbers of young people committing suicide there were quite remarkable. And it was as though one was triggering the other, and it was being publicised. And, you know, the whole thing was becoming a circle. And I come from a farming community originally, and I remember my father talking about in the 30s when farming was bad, if one farmer committed suicide, there would be 2 or 3 others soon after. I mean, is this known, or is this just totally wrong idea?
It's an interesting point, because it's what you're talking about there is suicide clusters, and that is something that is a terminology that a lot of organisations are working with. So one of the roles that I have in London is to support each of the local boroughs on their suicide prevention strategy. So each London borough has to have, and each community, local authority outside of London has to have a suicide prevention strategy. And one of the things you do need to consider is suicide clusters. And what we mean by that is where there are a significant number of suicides within a very short period of time that can be linked to each other. And I think there's a really quite prominent example of this of Bridgend in Wales quite a few years ago, which people may have heard. There's some nods. So there was a significant number of suicides in that population amongst the adults and the young people over a very short period of time. But what was quite unique as well is they all used the same method. One of the things that's been really highlighted out of that is the publication of what had happened. So what was happening at the time is once the first suicide had occurred, the newspapers were very open about what had happened, how they'd used method, you know, where they'd used it, things like this. So what we know about people who've been bereaved by suicide is you're significantly more at risk of taking your own life. So we had a community at that point that was bereaved by suicide, a very small community that all knew each other very well. And then what we presented there in that risk factor was all the details about how that person took their own life. So it resulted in quite a few people using the exact same method. And there's been a lot of learning around that, especially around the media and the reporting in the media sensitively around suicide, because they're not allowed to glamorise suicide. They're not allowed to sensationalise suicide, and one of the ways to do that is to not show method. I went to a really interesting event a few weeks ago for World Suicide Prevention Day, and it was at City Hall, and we had quite a senior member of the Met Police that was there at the time, and he was presenting on something he calls about places of interest or areas where you may have significant more suicides than anywhere else. And what he said is that the research is telling us is when the newspapers or online magazines will say that this place is where somebody has gone to take their own life, it becomes that place, because then everybody who is feeling at risk might flock to that. But actually when they don't do that, it doesn't become that place. So there's a lot that needs to be done around bereavement and suicide, and there's a lot that needs to be done around support in that, and also about awareness for local media and national media about how we report sensitively and appropriately. Because actually you can report on a suicide, but you don't need to give the location and the method. And where that person was. You can give a general area. So there is a lot of research around suicide clusters that are definitely very current, and people are very mindful of them when they talk about suicide. But there's a lot more awareness now around the safety around that language and the messaging that we share after that.
So I would just add that obviously I've worked for a long time in children's mental health services, and we have seen examples of that where young people have followed other people's lead in those sort of things. It's particularly common, I have to say, on the spectrum through suicidal thoughts with self-harming that can be really quite problematically contagious within school systems. And it's quite tricky. We had a couple of suicides within our wider services in southeast England, and the impact of social media again is something that we have to think about and understand. So there was, I don't want to go into too much specifics, but there was a person who had a particular hobby, if you like, and then there were some other suicides around London, and people were trying to understand possibly was there a linkage through social media and people knowing about that through a hobby-based connection. So public health officials then tried to target people in those hobby groups to try and lessen some of those difficulties. So it is a real issue that we have to take on board and be mindful of. Public health do have means that they very actively try and go in, certainly in children's mental health services. If ever there is a suicide, we quickly have to have a meeting within 48 hours and work with public health to try and mitigate some of these associating risks. It is interesting, this issue about how messages around suicide are shared in the safest way, or risks are shared in the safest way. So as I understand it, and Artie may know more about it, when there have unfortunately been suicides on public transport officials have changed the way they report that. So, you know, some of these leaves on the track issues are part of a wider thinking about whether you say or not what's actually happened, because it goes then back to some of these things around impulsivity as to whether that might be part of mitigating some of the risks where people may do things impulsively.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
I just want to go back to the beginning of what you said when the lady asked the question. Did you say that people that have been exposed to within the close community of suicide are more likely to commit, to think about it?
They're more at risk. They're more at risk of then going on to take their own life, and there's been sadly quite a few cases, and you can imagine with the service that we do, we get a lot of people that do come to us when they've been bereaved by suicide, that people have gone on to take their own life as well within that small community around that. And that could be the friends and family network, or that could be like, you know, the wider community workplace network and things like that. But there is a significant risk factor if you have been bereaved by suicide.
And the lady's example was quite a nice one, and that's the sort of thing that public health actively try and look at when you have these rapid response meetings. So your example about a farming community, presumably when a farming community is under considerable duress, economic downturns, those sorts of things can help foster certain types of clustering of suicidal behaviours.
Is that the case as well then within a family system? Are you saying
it can be
within I understand what you say within a community, but within a family system?
It can be, absolutely. It can happen, and we have had, we know of quite really sad, one of our trustees, his daughter died by suicide and then his wife did. So we know that that is something that can happen within families. So what we do in what we call postvention, when somebody has died by suicide, it's a word that's actually used as postvention. So in suicidology, that's what they use. What we do in postvention is incredibly important about helping to reduce future suicides and helping to prevent future suicides because those who've been bereaved. Yeah.
I mean, it's a matter of spreading a negative coping strategy for when you're sad. I think is how you increase a talk about how do you cope when you're sad. So it's
Absolutely, yeah.
So reverting, because if somebody's dying that way because it was trying to cope in a bad way.
Yeah.
Postvention is about trying to give people the correct resilience skills and mitigating those risks.
And it can be because it's almost sharing that, you know, if you're really sad and you're in a lot of pain, you take your own life. But what we hear from a lot of people that have tried to take their own life, maybe in those scenarios, is actually for them, they just wanted to be with that person and they just didn't know any other way because they couldn't imagine life without that person. So it's also linked in with the grief, you know, and the bereavement and the loss of losing that person. And it's not really ever something that's usually well thought out either. It's just a lot of pain. I don't know how to live without that person, so maybe this is what I'll just do just to be with them. So, you know, there's quite individual and really unique reasons as to why somebody may go on to do that. But I'm just conscious of time, so I'm okay if we move us on, if that's okay, guys. But just to quickly go over some general signs that we may see in somebody who's in pain and distress, and this might echo some of your conversations. So we may see things around isolating behaviours, so isolating themselves from things that they usually do. That can come under withdrawing as well. You can see things around self-harming behaviours. And I think what's really important about to note about self-harming behaviours is it can cover a really wide spectrum of different things. You can think about appetite, you know, like food, like how you might self-harm with food. You can also think about behaviours that you might engage with in the community that can be considered self-harming, as well as the traditional. You may see people that actually just quite openly tell you that they don't want to be here anymore. And they don't want to do this anymore, or they just want things to end, and you may see some of those things. So it's about noticing changes in behaviour. What we know about signs is if you know what someone's typical behaviour is, then you can get an understanding of what is untypical for them, what feels different about them. And then maybe we can have that conversation. And it might just be even saying, I've just noticed that something's a bit different about you recently. Can we just have a chat? What's going on? And it's just about starting that conversation and noticing and saying, I don't think you seem very happy lately. What's been happening? Well, I haven't seen you around much. What's going on? And think about your friends and family network right now that you know, and think about when you've probably noticed a change in them, a change in their behaviour. I think another really important message of today's presentation is about if you do decide to have a conversation with someone, it isn't about having the answer. Nobody needs you to fix anything for them. And I think as a community, as a society, we get really fixed up on this. We're all very much like, I need to fix this, and if I start this conversation, I'm going to be under all this pressure to fix it for you, and actually I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to have this conversation. And you don't need to. Often, you know what people need is a bit of listening. They need you just to listen to them, especially if you know them and you have a relationship with them. Just sit and hear them. I always think as a society, one of the biggest things that we do when we listen is we listen to reply. We don't listen to listen. And it's an action really to think about scenarios where you've listened to reply and where have you listened to listen. It's a really great skill to have, and we all have it. We just don't use it that often. It's not about us in that moment when we're talking to someone who's in distress, who needs a bit of help. It's about them. It's not about us bringing in a story about a friend who went through it and got through it and they'll be fine, so you'll be fine. It's about sitting with them and saying, you know what, that sounds really awful. And I'm not even too sure what to say, but you know what, why don't we get help and support together? I'm really glad you told me, and I don't want you to be alone in this. Get help and support. Go to services and get that. Now, obviously, these are things that are potentially related to around suicide, but we do know that the BDD Foundation does exist and can be a great source of support around any concerns that you have around that as well. Because ultimately, what we're saying here and the message of everything we're doing today is about hope. People who feel suicidal often feel very hopeless. There's no way out, there's no hope for them, there's no future. So if we can help them to find hope, even if that hope is they don't have to do this alone, it can be so much more powerful than you actually think. On our helpline every day, this is what we do. We give people hope because we sit with them and we talk to them and we say, you're not alone in this, we're together. So let's talk about Hopeline. Let's talk about Hopeline UK. As you can see, hope is in our name. This is a national suicide prevention helpline. Anyone who is 35 and under who is thinking about suicide, they can call, text and email to get some help and advice. We offer practical advice on our helpline and it is confidential. So what that means is we deal with the immediate risk of suicide to get that person to a place of safety and to also get them to think, to rationalise. But for example, it could be that somebody has financial issues and that's why they're calling us and why they're thinking about suicide. It could be because they have BDD and that's why they're calling us. So what we will do is signpost them to the other services that will help with the specific issue, but we deal with the suicide on the helpline. That's what we deal with. So, like I said, anyone in the age of 35 can contact us, but it's also important to note that if you do give this number to someone, we do have an intervention policy. So what that means is that if somebody contacts us and says they've already taken steps to end their life, or they're in an area that's unsafe, or they have method with them and they're not agreeing to keep safe, we will call the emergency services, because we believe if we can save a life, we will absolutely try. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, in those scenarios, we will always try to work with consent, because that's really important. But anyone who contacts us will be told from the very first conversation that we have an intervention policy, and we will get their agreement to continue the conversation. So they know that if anything changes in the space of that conversation, we may need to call the emergency services even without their consent. But we can imagine that if somebody has taken steps to end their life, and then they call a suicide prevention helpline, maybe there's a part of them that actually wants to live. So we get a lot of people that are very cooperative about that. The secondary element to the number is for any of you sitting here today who might be worried about someone. If you're worried about a family member, a friend, a co-worker, you might be thinking, maybe after today's presentation, I'm thinking them suicide might be something they're considering. I don't really know how to have this conversation, or it might be known that they're suicidal and maybe you're thinking, I don't really know what to do next. We do a lot of safety planning with our young people on the helpline, and we can help you to have those conversations around safety planning as well. So please pass that number on to people in the community. We started because of parents who lost their children to suicide, so they wanted to make sure that people around a young person who was suicidal also felt they could get some help and support as well. So that's the helpline. But like I said, today's presentation is just a presentation and it doesn't give us a lot more in terms of the skills. So there are other training opportunities that are available within Papyrus. If any of you are interested in any of our training and thinking to come along, please do. We have a 90-minute session called Spot, which is all about spotting the signs. We have a 3.5-hour session called Speak, which is all about how we talk about suicide. And then we have a suicide first aid course called Assist, which is how we assist someone with the thoughts of suicide, and that is 2 days. So if any of you are interested in finding out more, I'll be on the stall over the break, so please come and see me and we can have a chat about it. But before I finish, I just want to leave with a really important message about how difficult it is to support someone who is thinking about suicide. It's really not the easiest thing to do at all. I think Hannah downstairs shared some really interesting tips about like self-care and what self-care looks to you, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I do my nails every week, so I love that she shared about nails, and I do them myself, and it's just my own thing that I do, and I love that. But you know, self-care doesn't have to look like running on the beach and things like that, you know. It'd be great if you live near a beach and you could. I mean, I'd love to, but I don't know where the nearest beach is, so I can't do that. But you know, it's about defining what your self-care is, because I really believe that you can only help someone else if you feel in a good place to do that, and if you feel supported as well. So that's why you don't have to be on your own. If you've got someone in your life who's thinking about suicide, talk to other people around you, talk to services, get help and support for yourself as well as for them. And that's why that self-care is really important. So it just leaves me to say, finally, to say thank you for listening to today's presentation. There's lots of ways you can keep in touch with Papyrus if you want to know a little bit more about what we do. But like I said, we'll be around at the end or even over breaks if anybody has any questions. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you.